I was 27 when I met Dalton at Sarah's housewarming party in Richmond, and I knew within 5 minutes of talking to him that he was exactly the kind of man I'd been looking for. Not because of some fairy tale romance nonsense, but because he had his shit together in ways that actually mattered. He owned his own house, had a steady job as an accountant, drove a reliable car that was actually paid off, and when he talked about his future plans, they weren't some pipe dream about becoming a rock star or traveling the world with no money. This was a grown man who understood how real life worked, and after dating a string of losers who couldn't even split a dinner check properly, finding someone financially stable felt like winning the lottery. The way he looked at me that night, like I was the most interesting person in the room, told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. He was clearly smitten, asking thoughtful questions about my marketing job, actually listening when I talked about my career goals. And by the time he asked for my number, I was already mentally planning how this relationship would unfold. Sarah kept giving me these knowing looks from across the room, probably thinking she was witnessing some romantic moment. But honestly, I was just relieved to finally meet someone who could provide the kind of life I deserved. Our first few dates confirmed everything I'd hoped for. Dalton took me to nice restaurants without checking the prices on the menu, bought tickets to shows I mentioned wanting to see, and never once suggested we split the bill or meet somewhere cheap. He had this way of planning thoughtful dates that showed he was actually investing in getting to know me, not just trying to get me into bed as quickly as possible like most guys. When he picked me up, his car was clean, he was always on time, and he dressed like someone who took pride in his appearance. These might sound like basic things, but after the disasters I dated before, basic competence felt revolutionary. The sex was decent enough, nothing that would blow your mind, but he was attentive and seemed genuinely concerned with making sure I enjoyed myself. More importantly, he was the kind of guy who would still respect me in the morning, who wanted to take me out for breakfast afterward and hold my hand while we walked around downtown. He wasn't trying to sneak out before dawn, or pretend like nothing happened when we ran into his friends. Dalton introduced me to people as his girlfriend with obvious pride, posted pictures of us together on Facebook, and started including me in his weekend plans without me having to drop hints or manipulate the situation. By our 6-month anniversary, I was already envisioning how our wedding would look. Nothing too extravagant, but classy. The kind of ceremony that would photograph well and make all my friends slightly jealous of how put together my life had become. Dalton was clearly thinking along the same lines, making comments about our future that assumed we'd be together long term, talking about the renovations he wanted to make to his house like I'd be living there too. He even started asking my opinion about major purchases, treating me like a partner whose input actually mattered. When he proposed 2.5 years later, it was exactly the kind of proposal I'd been hoping for. Nothing over the top or public that would make me feel pressured to react a certain way. Just the two of us at the restaurant where we'd had our first official date, with a ring that showed he'd been paying attention to what I liked. The diamond was a respectable size. The setting was classic enough that it wouldn't look dated in photos years later. And when I called my sister afterward, even she had to admit that Dalton seemed like a catch. Planning our wedding was actually enjoyable because Dalton had opinions about things, but wasn't controlling about the details. He cared about having good food and an open bar, wanted to make sure his elderly grandmother would be comfortable, and left most of the aesthetic decisions up to me while making it clear that budget wasn't a major concern. We ended up with exactly the kind of celebration I'd always pictured, elegant without being flashy, personal without being too intimate, the sort of event that would make people think we had our lives figured out. Our honeymoon in Italy was honestly perfect. Dalton had planned the whole trip as a surprise, booking us into beautiful hotels and researching restaurants and museums ahead of time, so we wouldn't waste any time figuring out logistics. He took hundreds of photos of me against all these gorgeous backdrops, never complaining when I wanted to try different poses or change outfits. We spent 2 weeks eating incredible food, exploring historic cities, and having the kind of romantic experiences that other couples would be jealous of for years. The first 2 years of our marriage were exactly what I'd expected them to be. Dalton was reliable, affectionate, and generous with both his time and money. He never questioned my spending on clothes or beauty treatments, encouraged me to pursue the marketing opportunities that interested me most, and generally treated me like his opinion of me hadn't changed just because we'd signed some legal papers. We settled into comfortable routines that worked for both of us. He'd handle the yard work and major home repairs, while I managed the interior decorating and social calendar. And we'd spend our evenings watching shows we both enjoyed or going out with friends. He trusted me completely, which was both refreshing and sometimes slightly annoying. If I said I was working late or meeting girlfriends for drinks, he never questioned the details or acted suspicious about my plans. When I traveled for work conferences, he'd just tell me to have fun and text him when I landed safely. Part of me appreciated having a husband who wasn't constantly checking up on me or demanding to know my whereabouts. But sometimes his complete lack of jealousy made me wonder if he was just taking me for granted. The problem started around our 3rd year of marriage, though I didn't recognize them as problems at the time. Dalton had gotten comfortable in his routine, coming home at predictable times and wanting to spend most evenings doing the same things we always did. He'd work on his coin collection or read financial newsletters while I watched television, and our conversation started revolving around mundane topics like home maintenance projects or what we should have for dinner. It wasn't that he was treating me badly, but the excitement and romance from our early relationship had definitely faded into something more like roommate territory. That's when Ian started working at my company as the new regional director, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to have stimulating conversations with an intelligent man who was actually interested in my thoughts and opinions. Ian was in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed, drove a BMW that probably cost more than Dalton made in 6 months, and had the kind of corporate confidence that comes from years of success in competitive business environments. When he complimented my work on the Henderson campaign, it felt like someone was finally recognizing my professional capabilities instead of just seeing me as someone's wife. Our initial interactions were completely professional, just normal workplace conversations about strategy and client management. But Ian had this way of making me feel like my insights were valuable and worth developing further. He'd stop by my office to get my opinion on presentation approaches, invite me to join client meetings where I could showcase my expertise, and generally treat me like a colleague whose career advancement actually mattered to him. After spending my evenings listening to Dalton discuss the fascinating world of tax preparation, having someone engage with my mind felt incredibly refreshing. The first time Ian suggested we grab dinner to discuss the Morrison project, it seemed like a perfectly reasonable business meeting. We went to this upscale steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where serious professionals make important deals, and spent 2 hours talking about marketing strategies and industry trends. Ian had traveled all over the world for work, had fascinating stories about international business cultures, and seemed genuinely impressed by my ideas for expanding our client base. When he picked up the check without hesitation, it felt like the natural gesture of a successful executive, not anything inappropriate. These business dinners became more frequent as we worked on increasingly complex projects together, and I started looking forward to them in ways that probably should have been a warning sign. Ian would ask about my background, my career goals, my thoughts on everything from office politics to current events, and I found myself sharing opinions and perspectives that I never bothered discussing with Dalton. My husband's idea of intellectual conversation was explaining why certain penny mint marks were more valuable than others, while Ian and I debated business philosophy and analyzed market trends like actual adults. I started staying later at the office when Ian was working on important presentations, ostensibly to provide support and input, but really because I enjoyed being around someone who appreciated my professional capabilities. These late-night work sessions felt productive and important, like I was finally using my brain for something more challenging than deciding what color to paint the guest bathroom. Ian would order dinner for both of us. We'd work until 8 or 9, and I'd drive home feeling energized and accomplished in ways that my regular routine with Dalton never provided. When Ian mentioned that he'd be attending the regional conference in Denver and thought I should come along to help present our new client acquisition strategy, it seemed like exactly the kind of career opportunity I'd been hoping for. The company would pay for everything. I'd get to showcase my work to executives from other offices, and it would demonstrate that Ian saw me as someone worth investing in professionally. I told Dalton about the trip casually, mentioning that it was a great chance to network and possibly position myself for advancement opportunities. Dalton's response was typically supportive and completely trusting. He told me he was proud that my boss recognized my talents, said he hoped the presentation went well, and offered to take care of everything at home while I was gone. He even suggested I should buy some new professional outfits for the conference, giving me his credit card and telling me to get whatever I needed to feel confident and polished. His complete faith in my motives and his genuine excitement about my career development made me feel slightly guilty, but also reinforced how naive and simple he could be about the complexities of professional relationships. The Denver conference was where everything changed, though I convinced myself at the time that I was just enjoying a sophisticated business trip with a colleague who respected my abilities. Ian had booked us rooms on the same floor of this beautiful downtown hotel, and we spent the first evening having drinks in the lobby bar while discussing our presentation strategy. He looked incredibly handsome in his expensive suit, and I felt elegant and important sitting there with him, like we were the kind of power couple who belonged in settings like this. Our presentation the next day went perfectly, with Ian making sure to highlight my contributions and give me credit for the innovative approaches we were proposing. Afterward, Several executives from other regions complimented my work and asked for my business card, making me feel like I was finally being recognized for my professional talents. Ian suggested we celebrate with dinner at the hotel's rooftop restaurant, which had stunning views of the city and the kind of ambiance that made everything feel more romantic than it should have. That's when Ian first touched my hand while we were talking. Just a brief gesture that could have been interpreted as friendly encouragement. But something about the way he looked at me made it clear that his feelings had moved beyond purely professional territory. I should have pulled my hand away and redirected the conversation back to business topics. But honestly, it felt incredible to have someone so successful and sophisticated showing that kind of interest in me. After years of being taken for granted by a husband who seemed more excited about coin collecting than about spending time with his wife, Ian's attention felt like validation that I was still attractive and desirable. We ended up kissing on the hotel balcony later that night, and I told myself it was just the champagne and the romantic setting, that it didn't mean anything serious and certainly wasn't going to become a pattern. But when Ian suggested I should transfer to his division so we could work more closely together, and when he started finding reasons for us to attend conferences and client meetings in other cities, I found myself saying yes to opportunities that I knew were more about spending time together than about advancing my career. Over the next several months, these business trips became the highlight of my life. Ian would book us into beautiful hotels, take me to restaurants that Dalton would never think to try, and treat me like I was sophisticated and worldly instead of just some suburban housewife. We'd spend our days in productive meetings where I felt intellectually challenged and professionally valued. Then our evenings exploring new cities and having the kind of adventures that made my regular life seem incredibly boring by comparison. I became an expert at managing the logistics of these trips, making sure my stories to Dalton were consistent and believable, researching the actual business events that were happening in each city so I could provide authentic details about conferences and client meetings. Dalton never questioned my explanations, never asked to see presentation materials, or wondered why I was suddenly traveling so much more frequently than I had in previous years. His complete trust made everything easier, but also made me slightly contemptuous of how gullible he was. The physical relationship with Ian developed gradually, starting with romantic dinners and progressing to spending entire nights together in hotel rooms that felt like temporary escapes from my real life. Ian was more experienced and confident than Dalton, knew exactly how to make me feel desired and appreciated, and had this way of making me feel like I was special and worth pursuing. When we were together, I felt like the sophisticated, successful woman I'd always wanted to be, instead of just someone's wife who spent her days managing household routines. Ian would buy me expensive lingerie, take me shopping for clothes that were more stylish and flattering than anything in my regular wardrobe, and generally treat me like someone worth investing in. He had excellent taste in everything from wine to jewelry, and being with him felt like getting a crash course in how wealthy, successful people actually lived. Dalton was comfortable and reliable, but Ian was exciting and aspirational, representing the kind of lifestyle I'd always thought I deserved. The guilt I felt about deceiving Dalton was manageable because I convinced myself that what he didn't know couldn't hurt him, and that I was actually becoming a better, more interesting person through my relationship with Ian. I was more confident at work, more stylish in my appearance, and generally more satisfied with my life than I'd been in years. If anything, I was probably a better wife because I wasn't constantly feeling frustrated and underappreciated in my marriage. This arrangement continued for over a year, with Ian and I taking monthly trips together while I maintained my normal routine with Dalton at home. I got better at compartmentalizing the two relationships, appreciating what each man provided without feeling like I had to choose between them. Dalton offered stability and security, while Ian provided excitement and intellectual stimulation, and having both seemed like the perfect solution to the limitations of traditional marriage. The problem started when Ian began talking about leaving his wife and suggested that I should consider doing the same with Dalton. I'd always assumed that our relationship was a sophisticated arrangement between two adults who understood the complexities of modern life, not some dramatic affair that would require destroying our existing marriages. Ian had never seemed particularly unhappy with his family situation before, and I certainly wasn't interested in blowing up the comfortable life I'd built with Dalton just to pursue something uncertain and potentially messy. But Ian became increasingly possessive and demanding, wanting more of my time and attention than I was comfortable giving. He started calling me at home when he knew Dalton would be there, sending flowers to my office with romantic messages that my colleagues might see, and generally behaving in ways that threatened the careful balance I'd established. When I tried to explain that we needed to be more discreet, he accused me of not being serious about our relationship and threatened to tell Dalton about our affair if I didn't start making more concrete plans to leave my marriage. That's when I realized that Ian wasn't the sophisticated, mature man I thought he was. but just another guy who wanted to control and manipulate me for his own purposes. He'd been using our business trips and romantic dinners to create a sense of obligation and dependency, expecting me to abandon my secure marriage for the promise of a relationship with someone who was already proving himself to be unstable and demanding. The whole situation had become more complicated and stressful than it was worth, and I started looking for ways to end things without creating unnecessary drama. Unfortunately, Ian wasn't interested in ending our relationship quietly or amicably. He became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, showing up at my office when we hadn't planned to meet, calling me multiple times a day, and generally behaving like someone who was having some kind of emotional breakdown. When I told him that we needed to take a break and focus on our professional responsibilities, he responded by booking another business trip and insisting that I come with him to discuss our future. I should have refused to go on that trip. Should have recognized that Ian was becoming dangerously obsessed, and that continuing to enable his behavior would only make things worse. But I was afraid of what he might do if I rejected him completely, worried that he could damage my career or create problems with Dalton if I didn't handle the situation carefully. So I agreed to go on what I planned to be our final trip together, intending to end things definitively and establish clear boundaries about our future professional relationship. The trip to the mountain resort was supposed to be my opportunity to explain to Ian that our affair had run its course and that we needed to return to being colleagues. Nothing more. Instead, he'd planned this elaborate romantic weekend, complete with champagne and roses in the hotel room, clearly expecting that a few days of luxury and attention would convince me to leave my marriage and commit to building a life with him. When I tried to have a serious conversation about ending our relationship, he became angry and accusatory, claiming that I'd been leading him on and that I owed him more consideration after everything he'd done for my career. We ended up having several heated arguments throughout the weekend, with Ian alternating between romantic gestures and emotional manipulation, trying every strategy he could think of to change my mind about ending our affair. He'd bought me expensive jewelry, made reservations at the resort's most exclusive restaurant, and generally tried to create the kind of romantic atmosphere that had worked in the past. But I was too focused on extracting myself from the situation to be impressed by his efforts. On the final evening of the trip, Ian convinced me to have dinner on our room's private balcony, claiming that he wanted to discuss our professional relationship and how we could continue working together effectively. Instead, he spent the entire meal trying to convince me that we belonged together, that our connection was too special to abandon, and that I was making a huge mistake by choosing security over true love. When he kissed me on that balcony, I let it happen because I was tired of arguing and just wanted to get through the rest of the weekend without any more dramatic confrontations. That night was the last time I slept with Ian, and I spent most of it planning how I was going to establish boundaries and get my life back to normal once we returned home. I was exhausted by the emotional intensity of the weekend and looking forward to returning to my predictable routine with Dalton, who never created this kind of stress or demanded these kinds of impossible decisions. Ian had shown me that excitement and passion weren't worth the complications they created, and I was ready to appreciate the peace and stability that my marriage provided. The drive home on Sunday was awkward and tense, with Ian making increasingly desperate attempts to convince me that I was making the wrong choice. He talked about the trips we could take together, the life we could build, the ways he could advance my career if I would just trust him and take the risk of leaving Dalton. By the time he dropped me off at the airport, I was completely drained and irritated, ready to put the entire experience behind me and focus on repairing whatever damage my distraction might have caused in my marriage. But when I pulled into my driveway that Sunday evening, I immediately knew that something was wrong. All of my belongings were stacked on the front lawn in neat piles, covered with tarps like someone had been planning this for hours. My clothes, my books, my personal items, everything that belonged to me had been removed from the house and arranged on the grass like some kind of bizarre yard sale. Dalton was sitting on the front porch steps with a manila envelope in his hands, looking calmer and more composed than I'd ever seen him. My first reaction was confusion and anger rather than guilt or remorse. How dare he go through my personal belongings and throw them outside like I was some kind of criminal being evicted from my own home? What gave him the right to make this kind of dramatic gesture without even talking to me first, without giving me a chance to explain whatever misunderstanding had caused this ridiculous overreaction? I marched up to the porch, ready to demand an explanation for this childish behavior, assuming that I could straighten out whatever misconception had led to this absurd situation. But when Dalton handed me that manila envelope and I saw the photographs inside, I realized that this wasn't a misunderstanding or an overreaction, but the inevitable consequence of a year-long deception that had finally been discovered. There were pictures of Ian and me on the hotel balcony, kissing against the mountain sunset like some kind of romantic movie scene. There were photos of us entering the hotel room together, holding hands in the restaurant, looking at each other with obvious intimacy and affection. Someone had been following us, documenting our entire weekend, capturing evidence of everything I thought was private and secret. My immediate response was to attack Dalton for violating my privacy and having me followed like some kind of criminal. What kind of paranoid, controlling husband hires a private investigator to spy on his own wife? How long had he been having me watched? And what other invasions of privacy had he committed while I was trying to live my life and advance my career? This was exactly the kind of possessive, manipulative behavior that had driven me to seek companionship elsewhere in the first place. And now he was acting like he had some kind of moral high ground just because he'd hired someone to violate my personal space. But Dalton wasn't interested in arguing or listening to my explanations about privacy violations and trust issues. He just sat there with that calm, cold expression, waiting for me to finish my defensive rant before asking me simple, direct questions about the evidence in those photographs. Did I kiss Ian on that balcony? Did I spend the night in his hotel room? Had I been lying about my business trips for the past year? Each question was like a trap, forcing me to either continue lying in the face of photographic evidence or admit to deceptions that would destroy any remaining credibility I might have. When I tried to explain that the situation was more complicated than it looked, that my relationship with Ian had been primarily professional, and that any personal involvement had been a mistake I was already planning to end, Dalton cut me off with a level of coldness I'd never seen from him before. He told me that he'd already contacted a lawyer, that the divorce papers would be filed first thing Monday morning, and that I had until the end of the week to arrange somewhere else to live. He'd changed the locks on the house, removed my name from all the joint accounts, and generally taken every possible step to protect himself from any further deception or manipulation. The speed and thoroughness of his response was almost more shocking than the fact that he'd discovered my affair. This was the same man who took weeks to decide which restaurant to try for dinner, who researched major purchases for months before making a decision, who generally approached every aspect of life with careful consideration and methodical planning. But when it came to ending our marriage, he'd moved with ruthless efficiency, anticipating my possible responses and cutting off every avenue I might have used to negotiate or manipulate the situation. I spent that night at a hotel, calling my sister and trying to figure out how to salvage something from this disaster. My initial plan was to hire my own lawyer and fight Dalton's divorce petition, to argue that his controlling and suspicious behavior had created the problems in our marriage, and that I deserved a fair settlement, regardless of whatever mistakes I might have made. Surely any reasonable judge would understand that marriages are complicated, that people make errors in judgment, and that one affair shouldn't result in a woman losing everything she'd helped build during years of marriage. But over the next few days, it became clear that Dalton had been planning his response for much longer than just the weekend I'd been away. He'd documented every lie I told about business trips, had records of the company credit card charges that proved Ian and I had been traveling together, and had apparently been building a case against me for weeks or possibly months. When my lawyer reviewed the evidence Dalton's attorney provided, she told me bluntly that I had very little leverage in the divorce proceedings and should focus on negotiating the best possible settlement, rather than trying to fight the basic facts of the case. Even worse, Dalton had reported the affair to our company's human resources department, providing them with evidence that Ian and I had been using company funds for personal travel and violating multiple workplace policies about relationships between supervisors and subordinates. Within a week of returning from that mountain resort, both Ian and I were called into separate meetings with HR representatives and informed that our employment was being terminated immediately for policy violations and misuse of company resources. Losing my job was almost more devastating than losing my marriage, because it meant that I'd sacrificed everything for a relationship with Ian that had already proven itself to be worthless and destructive. Ian immediately distanced himself from me once we were both fired, claiming that I'd seduced him and that he'd been trying to end our affair for months, but hadn't known how to extract himself from the situation. He threw me completely under the bus, portraying himself as the victim of my manipulation and refusing to take any responsibility for the decisions we'd made together. The next few months were a nightmare of legal proceedings, financial stress, and social humiliation. Dalton kept the house, the car, and even our dog, while I moved in with my sister in Norfolk and tried to find another job in a market where potential employers could easily discover the circumstances of my termination from my previous position. The divorce settlement left me with almost nothing, since Dalton's lawyer successfully argued that my adultery and financial misconduct had contributed to the breakdown of the marriage and that I deserved no alimony or significant property division. Meanwhile, Ian became increasingly unstable and threatening, apparently unable to accept that our affair was over and that we'd both lost everything because of our poor decisions. He started following Dalton around town, sending anonymous threatening emails, and generally behaving like someone who was having a complete psychological breakdown. Dalton had to file a restraining order and involve the police, which only added to the drama and public embarrassment of the entire situation. The worst part was watching how quickly Dalton moved on with his life while I was still dealing with the consequences of our failed marriage. Within months of our divorce being finalized, he'd been promoted at work, had started dating someone new, and seemed happier and more confident than I'd seen him in years. Meanwhile, I was living in my sister's spare bedroom, struggling to find employment, and dealing with the reality that my affair with Ian had cost me everything I'd spent years building. In a moment of desperation, I decided to send Dalton a message acknowledging that I'd made mistakes and asking if we could find some way to reconcile and rebuild our relationship. I sent him one of our honeymoon photos, along with a long text, explaining that I'd never really loved Ian, that I just felt unappreciated in our marriage and had made terrible decisions because I didn't feel loved or valued. I told him that I hated myself for what I'd done and begged him not to let my mistakes destroy what we'd built together. But Dalton didn't even respond to my message. And when I tried calling him the next day, I discovered that he'd blocked my number completely. That's when I finally understood that there would be no reconciliation, no opportunity to explain my perspective or negotiate a different outcome. He'd moved on with his life completely, while I was still trying to figure out how to rebuild everything I'd lost. Now, almost a year later, I'm still living with my sister and working a job that pays half of what I was making before this whole disaster started. Ian occasionally tries to contact me, usually when he's been drinking, but I've learned to ignore his calls and messages since any association with him only reminds me of how much I lost because of our affair. Dalton has apparently become some kind of mentor to other men going through divorces, sharing his story about how to protect yourself when your wife cheats and how to move forward after betrayal. Everyone acts like I'm this terrible person who destroyed a good marriage for selfish reasons, but they don't understand how lonely and unappreciated I felt in that relationship, or how Ian made me feel valued and important in ways that Dalton never did. Yes, I made mistakes and handled the situation poorly, but I was trying to find happiness and fulfillment in a marriage that had become boring and predictable. If Dalton had been more attentive to my needs and more interested in keeping our relationship exciting, none of this would have happened in the first place. The whole experience has taught me that men can be incredibly vindictive when their egos are hurt, and that they'll use the legal system and social pressure to punish women who don't live up to their expectations of perfect loyalty and devotion. Dalton could have handled our problems like an adult, through counseling or honest communication, but instead he chose to destroy my life and turn everyone against me, just because I made some poor decisions during a difficult period in our marriage,